For years, no one knew what went on behind that locked door. My name is July. I'm 26, but I still wake up at night to the smell of damp concrete and old oil seeping through the gaps in the wood. It's the kind of memory that doesn't go away, even when you try to convince yourself that you survived. Because surviving, in my case, was just continuing to breathe while everything else was ripped away from me in silence. When I was 7, my mother died in a car accident. It was instantaneous, they said. I don't remember the impact. I only remember the silence that followed, the broken glass scattered on the asphalt, and the sound of rain on the hood. After that, I went to live with my grandfather. He was the only close relative left, on my father's side, whom I never got to know properly. My father had disappeared from the map even before I was born. Nobody talked about him much. The old man lived alone in a remote house at the end of a dirt road, the kind that has no name, just dust and tall bushes. He had no neighbors, no children around, and maybe that was on purpose. He was a big man with a hard look, and he spoke little. Everything he did was methodical, from eating times to the way he folded dishcloths. He had a mania for cleanliness, but the house always seemed dirty. Not because of a lack of hygiene, but because of a lack of life. At first, I thought it was just his way, someone that loneliness had hardened, but I soon realized that there was something else behind the silence, something denser, darker. The basement was at the back of the house, hidden under an iron staircase. It had a thick, swollen wooden door and a heavy latch on the outside. I only went down there for the first time because he told me to. I had no choice. He said it was the new room. He told me not to ask questions, that a well-mannered child obeyed. The first night, I thought it was punishment. Maybe I'd done something wrong, left something out of place, spoken too loudly, but the truth was that it didn't matter what I did. I would be there anyway. He said that it was safer down there, that it was for my own good. These phrases, repeated with such conviction, confused my childish mind. Part of me wanted to believe it. There was a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, and a dim light bulb on the ceiling. The walls, stained with seepage, seemed to breathe with me, shrinking and expanding in silence. Time didn't pass down there. I didn't know if it was day or night. All I could hear were his footsteps upstairs, heavy footsteps, controlled. The food came on a deep plate, twice a day, always cold. There was never any cutlery, and silence was the rule. If I cried or complained, I stayed there longer, sometimes for days. And when he took me out, it was as if I had to say thank you, a favor, a concession. I was trained to say thank you every time he opened the door, as if I had been saved from something worse, when in fact he was hell itself. The following years blurred together in flashes. I grew up there, losing teeth, gaining height, learning to calculate my steps so as not to trip in the dark. He would take me upstairs a few hours a week just to show the neighbors in town that he had a granddaughter, that I was fine. On these visits to town, he made me wear loose clothes and told me not to talk too much. He always said, "People make things up when they hear too much." I learned to smile with my whole face, except my eyes. I learned to lie naturally. I used to say that I was homeschooled, that my grandfather took good care of me, that I was happy. The small town never doubted it. Or maybe it just preferred not to know. When I turned 14, I started having nightmares when I was awake. I'd stay in the basement feeling his breath outside the door. Sometimes he'd come in, sometimes I just watched. And I never knew which was worse, the nights when he came in or the nights when he just watched, waiting for something. At 16, I didn't cry anymore. I just counted the marks on the wall. A scratch for every day I was locked in, a silent calendar made with my fingernail. I didn't have a mirror, but I knew I looked different. Older, stronger perhaps, but also emptier. That's when he started disappearing for longer periods of time. Sometimes it was gone for days. I learned to open the latch with a rusty wire I found under the mattress. I'd go out just to get some food from the kitchen, and I'd be back before he knew it. I never ran away. I don't know why. perhaps because the outside world was even more unknown than that captivity. At 19, I started writing, on pieces of bread paper with charcoal. I wrote what I remembered about my mother. I wrote about what I thought freedom was, and I promised myself that one day no one would ever step on my silence again. But that day didn't come for me. It came because of his death. It was a fall, a silly one, a slip on the stairs. His body lay there on the living room floor with his eyes open and a strangely calm expression. I spent 3 days not knowing what to do, locked in the basement, listening to the sound of the flies increasing. It was a different noise, warm, too alive for that place. When I finally managed to get out, I walked around the house. For the first time, I could touch the walls without fear. I opened cupboards, rummaged through drawers, and that's when I found it. A cell phone, old and cracked, hidden in a false compartment in his bedroom closet. There were videos. After he died, time seemed to go into suspension. The house stopped. The air became thick, dense, like burning oil. I wandered through the rooms as if I were stepping onto foreign soil, observing details that had previously been forbidden to me. The texture of the curtains, the specific creak of each floorboard, the sweet, rotten smell coming from the cupboard where he hid things I never knew existed. I spent days exploring. I didn't know whether to wait for the police, neighbors, someone, but no one came. And maybe that's why he always chose to live so isolated. It was a place where screams got nowhere. In his room, there was obsessive organization. Drawers with perfectly folded clothes, documents stacked by date, an envelope with bills paid over 20 years ago. Everything meticulously kept. But what really took my breath away was that wooden box, locked with a rusty padlock, tucked away in the back of the closet. Next to it, the cell phone I had found in the false compartment. The device was old, almost out of battery. I plugged it into the charger next to the bed and waited. The lights flickered. The screen came on. I shivered as I tapped the gallery icon. I was sure I should stop there. Something in me begged me to leave that phone where it was, to bury it, to forget about it. But I couldn't. It was as if I needed to confirm what my body had always known, but my mind refused to name. The videos started playing. My stomach turned inside out the second I saw my own face, younger, too thin, wide-eyed, sitting on the cold basement floor. He spoke to me in a low voice, whispered instructions, and I obeyed. I didn't understand at the time what those scenes meant. I just remembered the constant feeling of fear, the desire to disappear. But seeing it now, as an adult, I understood everything, and it hurt, as if every second spent down there had come back to devour me all at once. I watched 2 of them. Then I threw up in the bathroom. I went back a few days later. I watched 3 more. One of them showed him setting up the camera, adjusting the angle, testing the audio. My body appeared in the corner, motionless. It was like watching a macabre performance, where I was the puppet and he was the director of my own nightmare. The locked box was next. I didn't have the courage to break in alone. I used a kitchen knife and forced the lock until the metal gave way. Inside, there were old tapes, developed photos, some notes in notebooks with meticulous handwriting, everything cataloged, dates, times, descriptions, a sick archive. He recorded everything as if he were a researcher studying a caged animal. I sat on the floor for hours, surrounded by it all, not knowing what to do. Report it? Hand it over to the police? What more proof did they need? But at the same time, a part of me felt that if I handed over that material, I would never have peace again. It would become a headline, a news story, and I would become the girl in the basement. And I wanted to be anything but that. I wanted to be someone with a name, with a future, with the freedom to choose who I was, not the remnants of a tragedy. So I hid everything again. I wrote in a notebook the places where I kept each item. I buried the cell phone in a plastic bag behind the tool shed, along with the tapes. The photos were burned in the yard. The ashes flew away as if they had never existed, but the memory, that can't be extinguished by fire. The following days were silent. Nobody showed up. No police, no social worker, no acquaintances of my grandfather. It was as if he was invisible to the outside world. And, by extension, so was I. When he died, I inherited the house. No one disputed it. No documents remained outstanding. Everything was automatically transferred into my name. A cruel irony. That prison was now mine by legal right. I had a choice. Stay or go. I stayed. Not out of attachment, not out of fear, but because I needed to understand who I was outside that basement. I needed to walk around the house as an owner and not as a prisoner. I rediscovered the rooms, cleaned the walls, threw away the sheets, but no product could take away the smell of memories. The concrete seemed to whisper the things he said, as if it had absorbed every word spoken down there. I started sleeping in the master bedroom, but I never managed to turn off the light at night. Every crack in the wood made my heart race. The idea that he could be back was irrational, but real enough to keep me awake until dawn. One morning, I woke up to a noise in the basement, a dry pop. I thought it was a bug. I took a flashlight and went downstairs slowly. The door was ajar. I didn't remember leaving it like that. The light flickered on the ceiling, like a faint heart. I went down the steps. Downstairs, everything was in place. The mattress now folded up in a corner, the empty bucket, the marks on the wall. But one thing paralyzed me. There was a sheet of paper on the concrete floor. New, white, dust-free. I picked it up with trembling hands. I recognized the handwriting. It was his. July, it wasn't your fault. It was my nature. I almost dropped it. I ran upstairs, locking all the doors. I cried in silence, sitting with my back to the wall, trying to understand how that note had appeared. Had it been left before I died? How? When? When? Or was there something else? Something I couldn't or didn't want to see? Over the next few days, I didn't talk to anyone. I carried on living, going to the town market, responding with automatic smiles, but something had changed inside me. It wasn't just the memory of what he had done. It was the realization that somehow he was still there, not in the flesh, but in shadow, in trace. In every crevice of that house that seemed to be watching me. That's when I decided to open the old metal cupboard that was locked in the shed in the back garden. I never managed to open it when I was younger. The key was hidden in the medicine chest, as I discovered by rummaging through everything. When I finally opened it, what I found floored me. Inside were children's clothes, old toys, and more photographs, but they weren't mine. They belonged to other children. I stood there as if my feet had been driven into the ground. The metal cabinet revealed not only a new horror, but a truth that changed everything I thought I knew about my own history. The children's clothes folded in meticulous piles didn't belong to me. There were shoes that were too small, caps with embroidered names that I had never seen before. The toys were in good condition, clean, dust-free, as if they had been put away with zeal. But the hardest part to face were the photos. Lots of faces. Children of various ages, some smiling slightly, others serious, as if they knew something was wrong when they clicked. In several, my grandfather's figure appeared partially. A hand on a shoulder, a shadow in the background, a reflection in the mirror. Never prominent, but always present. He had a pattern. Dates written in pen on the back of each picture. Always months apart, always with different names. There were boys and girls. They all looked between 5 and 10 years old. I began to understand that what he had done to me was perhaps not unique. Maybe it hadn't even started with me. I tried to remember if, during all those years, I had noticed any trace of these children. Voices, traces, none. The house had always seemed empty, as if the world was just about him and me. But now, that proof was forcing me to reconsider everything, and above all, to admit that I wasn't the first. For days, the cupboard remained open. I stared at it as if it were an inverted altar, a sick temple of secrets. I wrote down as many names as I could identify. There were labels on clothes, initials scribbled on toys, loose details that I tried to put together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. At night, I dreamt of children's voices calling me from the bottom of the cellar. I would wake up sweating with the impression that one of them had passed me in the corridor. I called the police. I didn't tell them everything. I just said that I had found suspicious objects in my recently deceased grandfather's house. They came, photographed everything, collected the items, asked questions. I answered with restrained sentences, without mentioning the videos or the note. I just said that I felt something was wrong. They didn't treat me with contempt, but with that silent caution of someone who still doesn't know if they're facing a victim or someone unstable. A younger agent, her eyes attentive, looked at me with a certain compassion. She said they would keep the case under investigation and gave me a protocol number. When they left, I felt a mixture of relief and emptiness, as if something had been forcibly removed from me and only the echo remained. The following week, a short story appeared in the local newspaper. Ancient objects found in home of deceased elderly man raised suspicions of unsolved disappearances. It was the kind of news that disappears in 2 days, the kind of story that nobody really wants to follow through to the end. But someone read it. 2 days later, a woman appeared on my doorstep. She looked tired, with deep-set eyes and a scarf tied around her head. She said her name was Anna, that she lived in the next town, and that her brother had disappeared when she was a teenager. She was leafing through the newspaper when she saw the photo of the cupboard. He said he recognized the cap, a navy blue one with an L embroidered in white. It was his brother's, Luis Felipe. He was 8 when he disappeared. I invited her in. I didn't know what to say. I just sat with her on the living room floor, and we stood there, looking at each other. She held the cap in her hands, as if it were made of glass. She told me that she'd always thought he'd been taken by a stranger, that the police had searched, that her family had gradually fallen apart over time. And now, after almost 20 years, there was an answer. Cruel, but real. I showed her some photos that I had kept myself before the police collected the rest. She confirmed 2 more children she knew from that time. She said they disappeared a few months apart. One of them was a street neighbor. The other went to the same school as Luis Felipe. When she left me a note. She said that, despite everything, she thanked me. Because even without meaning to, I had given a chance of closure to a story that until then had lived as a ghost. She called me brave. I didn't know how to respond, because inside, I felt empty, dirty, fragmented. Courage seemed too distant a word. That night, I sat on the basement stairs and stayed there until the sun came up, thinking about every face, every child who might have trodden where I did. How many promises my grandfather must have made. How many times he used the same phrases he used to say to me, "It's for your own good. It's safer here. You must learn to obey." The words took on a new weight now. I became obsessed with finding out more. I went to the town library, searched the old archives of the local newspaper, looked for police reports. I managed to put together a list of 9 missing children over a 15-year period. 4 of them matched the clothes and names I found. The other 5 seemed to fit into gaps that I still couldn't fill. I began to be called in to give further statements. A detective was assigned to the case. The tone of the investigation changed. There was now a real suspicion that my grandfather might be involved in a much darker network than anyone had imagined. And I was the only living piece in the puzzle. My house became a transit point for experts, journalists, and investigators. The privacy I never had in the basement now didn't exist outside either. In a way, I was still locked in. Only the bars had changed. And in the midst of all this, one thing still didn't make sense. There was a notebook hidden inside the bedside cabinet which the police never found, where he wrote loose sentences like a fragmented diary, incomplete passages, scattered thoughts. But one note in particular chilled me to the core. July was not the plan. July was an accident. I read and reread that sentence so many times that it began to lose its meaning. July wasn't the plan. July was an accident. What do you mean I was an accident? Was he referring to my coming to his house? Or was there something else? Something I hadn't understood yet? The note ate away at me, as if opening a door to questions that could no longer be asked. Not to him, but the doubt dug a hole inside me, one that forced me to dig around it, too. I began to question everything I knew about my history. My mother died in an accident. That's what everyone said. But was that really all there was to it? I went back to the newspapers of the time, looking for any information that would help me understand the context, what happened on that road that night. I found out that the accident was considered without apparent cause. The car overturned on a slight bend, on a stretch with no braking marks. According to forensics, she simply went off the road. No clear explanation, no mechanical fault, no trace of a collision, just silence. My grandfather's name appeared on the report as the person who was notified of the death. He was responsible for picking me up from the hospital. There was no one else. My father never showed up, as was to be expected, and no other relatives came forward. It was as if the whole world had turned a blind eye to my existence and handed me over to my jailer. I returned home with a weight on my shoulders. I entered his room again, holding my breath. I began to search everything, every crevice, every hidden compartment. Behind a loose board on the wall, I found a plastic folder covered with adhesive tape. Inside were old papers, certificates, medical documents, psychological reports on children I had never met. Some had official stamps, others seemed to have been copied from restricted archives. But among them, there was something that froze my blood. A letter signed by a social worker from another city recommending the suspension of a child's custody for inappropriate behavior by the guardian. The child's name? July. Me. The date was when I was 5, 2 years before I moved in with him. The letter suggested that my mother had tried to stop us living together, that there were indications that he was already showing signs of predatory behavior. But no one followed up. There was no prosecution, no protection. The recommendation remained forgotten in a drawer, and 2 years later, she died, and I ended up with the very person she tried to keep me away from. The knot tightened in my throat. Not only did he destroy my childhood, but perhaps he also got rid of the only person who tried to protect me. If my mother died because she opposed him, then I was the piece that remained, the one he could finally shape as he wanted. The accident was never just an accident, and I wasn't an accident. I was the target. It was as if my whole life had been manipulated since before I could write my name, and that wasn't paranoia, it was all there, on paper, written down, recorded, and ignored by everyone. I was up all night. The house seemed smaller, more suffocating. Every wall seemed to push the air out. I felt an absurd urge to get out of there, to leave everything behind, but at the same time, a greater impulse held me back. I needed to make it known, not just to the investigators, but to anyone who had ever had their life crossed by someone like him. It couldn't just be a footnote in the newspaper. It couldn't end in silence, as it began. I handed the documents over to the detective in charge of the case. This time I went further. I showed him the notebook, told him about the videos, the buried objects, the folder hidden in the wall. For the first time, I dropped all defenses. I spoke like someone who no longer wanted to carry anything hidden. He listened to everything, in silence. He took notes. He thanked me. And he left with a closed face. The next day, I received a call. They confirmed that some of the records they had found matched old files filed in neighboring towns. Some documents contained the signatures of authorities who had already retired. Others had simply disappeared from the official archives. But what shocked me most was what he said at the end of the call. There were records of my grandfather working in the 1970s and 1980s as an employee of a shelter for children at risk. For almost a decade, he had access to dozens of minors, children forgotten by the system, with no family, no one to notice if they disappeared or not. It hit me with brutal force. All his meticulous behavior, the way he organized his papers, his clinical notes, it all made sense now. He wasn't just a monster on impulse, he was a predator with method. A man who, for years, operated within a blind system, supported by bureaucracy and omission. I sat alone in the center of the room for a long time, staring at the walls of that house as if I were trapped in them. I wasn't just a survivor. I was living proof of a cycle that no one wanted to break, and so perhaps it was my responsibility to end it. I started to write everything down, every memory, every discovery, every fact, not as an outburst, but as a denunciation. I decided to create a complete file with dates, names, connections, a timeline that clearly showed that my grandfather was not an isolated case. He was a reflection of a system that had failed me and so many other children. The next morning, I received another unexpected visit. A middle-aged man wearing a worn jacket with restless eyes appeared at the door. He said he'd seen the story in the paper, that he'd called the police station and they'd mentioned my name as an informal contact. He showed a photo of his sister. Her name was Natalia. She disappeared when she was 7. I recognized the bow in her hair. It was the same one from one of the photos I'd found in the cupboard. The pain in his eyes didn't ask for an answer, only confirmation, and I gave it. At that moment, I understood that it no longer mattered how much it hurt to tell this story. It needed to be told, not for me, but for them, for the children who didn't come back, for the siblings who waited for decades, for the mothers who died without answers, for my mother, and above all, for that 7-year-old girl who learned to say thank you every time the door opened, thinking that was freedom. In the days that followed, the house was invaded by voices I never heard when I needed them most. Technicians, reporters, prosecutors, a constant din of footsteps, recordings, photographs, all searching for answers that might never be complete. I watched from the stairs, as if I were still a forgotten piece of furniture in that structure that had once been my prison. My name, for the first time, was pronounced as an active subject, July, the woman who survived, the one who exposed a predator, the one who revealed what so many preferred to bury. But that image of strength, printed in newspaper headlines and short snippets on TV, was a distorted reflection. I didn't feel strong, I felt like living flesh. Every time a new family knocked on my door looking for clues, traces, or crumbs of consolation, I was plunged back into hell. It was like opening wounds that had barely begun to heal. A woman brought me a faded teddy bear and asked if I remembered it. She said it belonged to her son, Rodrigo, who disappeared when he was 6. I couldn't answer, I just hugged her, and we cried together, 2 women united by a pain that shouldn't exist. The investigation expanded. Other cities began to re-examine old files. They reopened cases that had been closed without conclusion. In many of them, my grandfather's presence appeared like a cursed shadow, an invisible signature between the pages of omission. Traces were found on properties he had visited in the past, and more objects buried in backyards, locked away in sheds, forgotten in the bottoms of wooden cupboards. But among so many traces, one question never left my mind. Why was I spared? Or even crueler, was I spared? Perhaps he just decided to stretch out the suffering. Perhaps he saw in me a chance to test absolute control, an experiment, a broken toy that he decided to keep. I thought about leaving there countless times, abandoning that house, that city, everything that reminded me of him. But every time I got close to packing, something stopped me. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the fear of erasing everything without giving it a proper end. Because if I disappeared, the evidence would weaken. And I knew that in this world, women's pain always needs to be accompanied by concrete evidence, or it becomes an invention. I ended up moving, yes, but only when I was sure that everything he left behind had been properly analyzed, archived, connected to something bigger, a history, an inverted inheritance, made up not of goods, but of truths that weigh like lead. I rented a small apartment in a city where no one knew my face. I painted the walls in colors I'd never seen in my childhood home. I hung pictures with images that convey peace. And for the first time, I decided to sleep with the lights off. I still wake up startled. I still hear footsteps that aren't there. I still have days when my breathing fails for no reason. but now I know that this is part of the process. I went to therapy after much resistance. It took me months to be able to say out loud everything I was carrying. The first session was a sea of silence, but something inside me knew that even if I kept quiet, I was breaking a cycle. Talking would come later, and it did. Over time, I understood that I didn't need to make sense of what he did. There was no logic. There was no satisfactory explanation. Some horrors exist not because they are rational, but because someone has chosen to inflict pain for the simple pleasure of control. And accepting that is almost as difficult as surviving. I thought about writing a book, a complete account, give names, dates, reveal everything in detail. But I still don't know if I want to expose myself so much. Part of me wants to disappear. The other part wants to scream until no child has to learn to say thank you when the basement door opens. Some families keep in touch. We form a kind of silent network. We exchange messages, memories, sometimes just emojis, as a way of saying, we're still here, we're still breathing, we still resist. Recently, I received an envelope with no sender. Inside, a single photo. A girl with her hair tied up, looking at the camera with a fragile smile. On the back, only, you saved my story from becoming dust. I don't know who sent it. I don't know if the child in the photo survived. I don't know if it was a victim, a sister, a friend of someone who went through it. But I kept the picture in a little wooden box, very different from the ones he used. In it, I only put things that remind me that it was worth fighting for. Today, I have good days. Others, not so much. Sometimes I spend hours staring at the mirror, trying to recognize the woman who came out alive, July, a name that for a long time was just a whisper in the dark. Now it's a word I carry with pride. If this story made you think, don't leave without leaving a like, and comment below. What would you do in July's place? Every comment helps this truth not to be forgotten, and could be the voice someone needs to break the silence.